The morning shift at Merritt Automotive started the same way it always did. The groan of the hydraulic lifts, the hiss of air compressors cycling to pressure, the particular smell of motor oil and cold concrete that had soaked into the walls over 37 years. Fletcher Rourke arrived 12 minutes before his shift, the way he always did, parked his '94 Ford F-150 in the back corner where the security light had been burned out for 6 weeks, and pulled his coverall from the locker that still had the previous owner's name scratched into the metal above the latch. He had never bothered to scratch his own name in. There was something honest about that, about not marking a place you knew you were only borrowing. He was under the Escalade by 6:14. It had been sitting in Bay 4 since Thursday, tagged with a yellow service order that 3 different technicians had touched and put back without resolution. The listed complaint was a rough shift pattern between second and third gear, the kind of vague symptom that sent most mechanics straight to the computer diagnostic port and whatever the software told them to replace. Fletcher didn't touch the port. He lay on the creeper, closed his eyes for 4 seconds, and listened to the tick and settle of a cold engine in a cold building. Then he positioned his hands on the transmission casing and began. The technique had no name in the Merritt Service Manual because it wasn't in the Merritt Service Manual. It had been developed by Navy field mechanics in the early 90s for rapid diagnosis of rotary and hydraulic systems under combat conditions, situations where a computer readout was unavailable or untrustworthy, and the aircraft or vehicle in question needed to be either fixed or stripped in under 15 minutes. Fletcher had learned it at 22, applied it roughly 400 times across 14 years of service, and carried it into civilian life the way a man carries a scar, not thinking about it consciously, just using it, because it worked, and it was his. The pressure differential told him everything within 90 seconds. The valve body bore on the secondary clutch pack was scored, not catastrophically, just enough to bleed pressure under load. It was the kind of damage a visual inspection would miss, and a code reader wouldn't flag until the transmission failed completely, probably on an interstate, probably at speed, probably with someone's family inside. He noted the finding on the service card in the measured shorthand he used for everything, slid out from under the Escalade, and moved to the parts cabinet to pull the reseal kit. Darnell Pruitt was watching from the workbench where he had been watching things for 30 years. He was 65 and built like a man who had spent those years lifting rather than avoiding, with hands that looked like they had been cast in a mold designed for a larger species. He didn't say anything. He had learned in the first weeks after Fletcher was hired that the man worked better without commentary, the way certain instruments performed better without vibration in the surrounding environment. But his eyes followed the path from the Escalade to the parts cabinet and back, and the expression on his face was a settled quiet that meant he had noticed something and filed it away. The morning moved the way Monday mornings moved. 4 oil changes, 2 brake jobs, a tire rotation on a Suburban whose owner called twice to check on it. Fletcher worked through all of it at a pace that was neither hurried nor slow, just continuous, the way water moves through a channel it has worn smooth over time. The other technicians talked around him, about the weekend, about a game, about something someone's brother-in-law had done that was apparently worth describing in detail twice. Fletcher participated in none of it. Not from hostility, but from a kind of practiced removal, the same way a man in a loud room can choose which sounds to register and which to let pass through. He was back under the Escalade, midway through the reseal, when he heard the heels on the concrete. Sloane Merritt walked the shop floor the way her father had walked it, which was to say with the clipboard carried like a credential and the eyes moving across every surface looking for the thing that was wrong. She was 35, with the particular quality of stillness that comes not from calm but from sustained vigilance, from years of knowing that any visible uncertainty would be fed back to her by men who had already decided she couldn't do the job. The stillness was her armor. Fletcher, who had spent 14 years reading rooms for threat, recognized it the moment he first saw her, 3 months ago on his first day. He had not mentioned this observation to anyone. She stopped at Bay 4. The clipboard came up. She looked at the service card. She looked at Fletcher's legs extending from beneath the vehicle. She looked at the tool arrangement on the mat beside him, and specifically at the pressure differential gauge, which was not standard Merit equipment, which had no place in the Merit-approved tool set, and which she would not have been able to identify by name. Come out from under there. Her voice carried across the bay without effort and without warmth. Fletcher slid out. He didn't hurry. He stood, wiped his hands on the shop rag tucked into his pocket, and waited. What is that? Not a question. A challenge issued in the syntax of a question. Pressure differential gauge. I'm diagnosing a valve body issue on the secondary clutch pack. That's not in our diagnostic protocol. No, he agreed without apology or elaboration. Our protocol exists for a reason: consistency, liability, documentation. She was not looking at him. She was looking at the gauge the way she looked at everything she was preparing to disapprove of. Every technician in this shop follows the same process. The process missed a scored valve bore on this transmission for 3 days. A customer's going to drive this vehicle on I-25 with their kids in the back. The clipboard came down 2 inches. For a fraction of a second, something moved behind her eyes. Not doubt, but its shadow. Then it was gone. That's not your call to make. The car is in my bay. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds and contained approximately the weight of everything neither of them was going to say. Then Sloane Merritt straightened her spine to its full height and said the words that every person within 60 feet of Bay 4 heard clearly and would remember in detail for the rest of the week. You're terminated, effective immediately. Leave your badge at the front desk. The compressors cycled. A radio in the far bay played something with too much bass. Every technician in the building found something to look at that was not Bay 4. Fletcher looked at her. Not with anger. She would have known what to do with anger. He looked at her the way a man looks at something that has just broken and cannot be put back. I still have the afternoon shift, he said quietly. My daughter needs her medication. Sloane Merritt's jaw tightened by a fraction. She turned and walked toward the office corridor without looking back. Darnell Pruitt watched Fletcher gather his personal tools with the same unhurried efficiency he brought to everything else. The military green toolbox that had no origin story anyone in the shop knew, with its scratched NATO stock markings that Darnell had recognized on day 1 and never mentioned to anyone younger than himself. Fletcher latched it, lifted it by the handle, and carried it toward the exit without a word to anyone. At the door he paused and looked back once, not at the bay, not at the other technicians, but at the building itself, at the high industrial ceiling and the stained concrete and the quality of light coming through the north-facing windows. He looked at it the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to grieve. Then he was gone. The walk to Pearson's pharmacy on Larimer took 11 minutes at his pace. The November air came off the Rockies with teeth, and Fletcher walked into it with his collar up and his hands in his pockets, running the numbers he had been running since the moment the words left her mouth. The afternoon shift was 4 hours at his hourly rate. Without it, the week came up short. Nora's albuterol refill was $63. The inhaler device itself needed replacing. The pharmacist had mentioned it twice now, the third mention being the kind that contained professional concern. He had $42 in his checking account and a credit card that was $8 below its limit. He pushed open the pharmacy door at 6 minutes past 10. The prescription was ready. It was always ready. He called it in 2 days early now because of the one time he hadn't. The time Nora had woken at 2 in the morning with her airways closing, and he had stood in a 24-hour pharmacy in his socks counting change on the counter while a teenager watched him from the register. He counted the bills in his wallet at the pickup counter. $26. The copay was $63. I'm 37 short. He said it the way he said most things, without performance, without the apologetic verbal filler that people use to soften the contour of a hard fact. The pharmacist, whose name was Louise, and who had been watching this specific transaction approach for 2 months, pulled a sample box from beneath the counter before he finished the sentence. "This covers the week," she said. "We'll sort out the rest on Friday." She slid it across the counter with the practiced casualness of someone performing an act of grace and hoping the recipient wouldn't acknowledge it. Fletcher looked at the box. His jaw moved once, just once, then settled. "I'll be in Friday," he said. That was all. He took the box and turned toward the door. He heard it before he was fully outside. The sound entered through the pharmacy's glass facade before it entered through the door. A low rhythmic percussion that bypassed the ears and registered directly in the chest, in the sternum, in the specific column of bone and cartilage that had spent 14 years learning to distinguish between rotary aircraft at distance by sound signature alone. Fletcher's hand froze on the push bar, MH-60R, the Seahawk variant, modified for special operations transport, identifiable by the particular phasing of the main rotor against the tail, a half-beat offset that no other production helicopter in the U.S. Navy fleet shared. He knew this the way he knew the pressure differential on a scored valve bore. Not from thought, from sediment. He pushed through the door. The helicopter came from the northeast, low and direct, without the altitude that a civilian or medevac flight would maintain over a populated area. It descended toward the parking structure adjacent to the pharmacy with the purposeful geometry of a vehicle that knew exactly where it was going. People on the sidewalk stopped. A woman grabbed her child's shoulder. 2 cars pulled over without being sure why. Fletcher stood on the sidewalk and watched it come down. The landing was clean and controlled and took 40 seconds from first visual to skids on asphalt. The side door opened before the rotors had fully cycled down, and a figure in Navy working uniform dropped to the ground and walked toward him with the stride of someone who has covered dangerous ground in a hurry and learned not to waste motion. Commander Yvette Loring was 40 years old, with the kind of face that gave nothing away until it chose to. She wore special warfare insignia on her collar and carried a tablet in her left hand and nothing at all in her expression. She walked directly to Fletcher and stopped 2 feet away, which was the distance between having a private conversation and broadcasting it, and she chose the other one. The loudspeaker on the aircraft was not loud. It didn't need to be. The parking structure bounced it off concrete in every direction and handed it to the street, and the street carried it to everyone within half a block. United States Navy, we are here for Lieutenant Commander Rourke. Call sign Ironside. 11 phones came up. A delivery driver stopped his truck in the middle of the intersection and got out. The woman with the child took 3 steps closer rather than away. Fletcher did not move. He stood on the sidewalk in his worn coverall with the pharmacy sample box in his left hand and $37 he didn't have between him and his daughter's medication. And he looked at Yvette Loring, and something happened in his face that the 11 phone cameras would capture, and that people would describe differently in the comments. Some would call it recognition, some would call it resignation. One person who had served would call it the expression of a man who has spent years outrunning something that was always faster than him. Loring looked at him steadily. "The Admiral sent me personally, sir." Fletcher's eyes dropped to the tablet in her hand. On the screen, through the locked display, he could see the edge of a radar signature readout, a specific frequency pattern that his nervous system identified before his conscious mind caught up. His chest tightened around a breath he hadn't meant to take. "That's not my name anymore," he said. The words came out the way words come out when they have been said before, and stopped being true somewhere along the way. Loring didn't argue. She turned the tablet over and held it out, and the readout filled the screen. Satellite imagery, Gulf of Aden coordinates, a radar return from a sector he had flown 17 times in 14 months, and knew the way he knew the shape of Nora's handwriting on the drawings she taped to their refrigerator. He saw the anomaly immediately. Third sector, low altitude return, wrong signature for debris, wrong mass distribution for wreckage. The frequency shift on the trailing edge meant rotor drag. Specifically, the titanium frame of an MH-60 variant, partially submerged, orientation consistent with a controlled emergency ditching rather than impact. "That pilot is alive," Fletcher said. He had not intended to say it. It came out the way the diagnosis on the Escalade's transmission had come out. Not as a decision, but as a fact that existed and needed to exist somewhere outside his head. He ditched into coral reef structure. The reef's creating a radar shadow. He's hiding the aircraft. He looked up from the tablet and something had shifted in his face, something that was not entirely grief, and not entirely the absence of grief. He has maybe 8 hours before the tide covers the cockpit. Loring looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Then she keyed her radio. Behind him, through the pharmacy glass, Louise the pharmacist stood with her hands flat on the counter watching the parking lot. The delivery driver was still standing beside his truck. The woman with the child had her phone up but wasn't recording anymore. She was just watching. The way people watch things they will describe to someone later and find that language doesn't carry the full weight of. Fletcher Rourke stood on a sidewalk in Denver, Colorado, in a worn mechanic's coverall, and held a Navy tablet displaying a radar signature he had no business being able to read. And the city moved around him the way cities move around the still points inside them, without knowing, without caring, and entirely dependent on them anyway. Asked 2. The video hit 2 million views before noon. Sloane Merritt sat behind her father's desk. She still thought of it as her father's desk, still caught herself reaching for the drawer handle on the left side where he kept his reading glasses before remembering that the drawer was empty now, and watched it play for the 4th time on her assistant's phone. The footage was shaky in the way all-important footage was shaky, shot from a sidewalk by someone whose hands weren't steady because the situation didn't allow for steadiness. But the essential elements were clear enough. The helicopter, the uniform, the name called through the speaker into open Denver air, and Fletcher Rourke standing there in his coverall, holding a pharmacy bag, looking at the tablet like a man reading his own history in someone else's handwriting. She handed the phone back without a word and waited until the door closed. Then she pulled up the security camera archive on her desktop and found Bay 4. She watched herself walk across that concrete. She watched the way Fletcher came out from under the Escalade, unhurried, which she had read at the time as insolence, and was now reading as something she didn't have a clean word for. She watched him explain the tool and she watched herself not listen, and she watched the moment she turned away from him, and she understood with the clarity that comes after the fact and never before it, that she had looked at a man and seen only the surface of him. She opened a second window and searched. The military pressure differential technique had a designation she couldn't pronounce and a published accuracy rating of 98% under field conditions. The Merritt Standard Diagnostic Protocol, the one she had defended to his face 40 minutes before, carried a 73% accuracy rating on the same category of fault. She had known about the gap in the numbers. It was in a service efficiency report she had read 6 months ago and flagged for future review and not yet reviewed. The report was still in the flagged folder. The Escalade's valve bore was still scored. And Fletcher Rourke was no longer employed by Merritt Automotive. Her hand sat on the mouse without moving for a long moment. The knock at the door was Darnell Pruitt's knock. 2 deliberate raps, the kind that announced presence without requesting permission. He opened it before she responded, which was also characteristic, and he placed a single printed page on the desk in front of her without preamble. He had found it in 30 minutes using nothing more than a name and a public records database, which told her he had been looking before she thought to ask. Virginia Tech, Aerospace Engineering, graduated with distinction. Navy SEAL Aviation Pipeline, completed ahead of cohort schedule. 14 years of service. Then a gap. Not a discharge, not a transfer, just a cessation. The way a river sometimes disappears into the ground and reappears somewhere else without explanation. He's been here 6 years, Darnell said from the doorway. Not an accusation, just a number that meant something. Sloan looked at the page. You knew. I recognized the toolbox markings his first week. NATO stock codes. Special Warfare Series. He paused. I was going to say something. But you didn't. I figured a man hides for a reason. Didn't seem like my place to dig it up. He looked at her steadily across the width of the office. Would you have listened? She had no answer for that, and they both understood why. And Darnell Pruitt pulled the door closed behind him with the quiet of a man who has delivered what needed delivering and wants no part of what comes next. Sloan was still looking at the printed page when Admiral Clifton Hale arrived. She heard him before she saw him. Not his voice, but the particular quality of silence that preceded him through the building. The way noise relocated itself away from his path. He was 66 and moved like a man who had decided somewhere in his 40s that deliberateness was more useful than speed. 3 rows of service ribbons sat above his left breast pocket with the density of a completed record. He came through her office door with a folder tucked under his arm and sat across from her without being invited, which she didn't hold against him. Miss Merritt. He set the folder on the desk between them. I'd like to tell you about your employee. The folder was labeled with a classification stamp that had been partially redacted for civilian presentation, but the operation name was visible. Ironclad. She opened it. The photograph on the first page stopped her hand. Fletcher Rourke, younger by 6 years, and harder in ways that 6 years of carrying something heavy will erode. Standing in front of an MH-60 on a flight deck somewhere the background didn't identify. He was in flight suit and helmet, visor up, and he was looking at the camera with the directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to look away from things. Sloan found herself studying that face and trying to locate in it the man who had stood in Bay 4 that morning with a pharmacy bag in his hand, and the distance between the two images was not a distance of time alone. She turned to the mission brief. Gulf of Aden, 2017. 17 Navy SEALs pinned in a deteriorating compound during an extraction gone wrong. Equipment failure, weather system moving in, communications partially degraded. The rescue window was narrowing towards zero. Fletcher Rourke, call sign Ironside, flying the extraction support aircraft, went in on the first pass in conditions that the mission weather assessment described as beyond acceptable operational parameters. He brought 14 men out. The aircraft took damage on egress. Hydraulic line compromise. Partial loss of tail rotor authority. He landed it. He assessed the damage. He repaired the critical failure with materials available on the aircraft in 11 minutes and took off again. Sloan stopped reading and looked up at Hale. 3 men remained, the Admiral said. He said it the way people say things they have said before and have not found a way to say more gently. Chief Petty Officer Declan Webb, 2 others. Fletcher went back in. He led a beat pass. Webb and the others held the perimeter to give him the approach lane. They took the contact that was meant for the aircraft. Another beat. Fletcher landed. He reached Webb. Webb was already gone. He folded his hands on the desk. He held that position alone for 6 hours until secondary rescue arrived. He brought them home the only way he could. The office was very quiet. His wife was diagnosed 4 months after he came back, Hale continued. Pancreatic cancer. Their daughter was born the same year. Claire Rourke, who spent their last good year teaching Nora to identify cloud formations because she said a pilot's daughter should know the sky, died 14 months after the diagnosis. The girl was 2. He looked at Sloan without judgment, which was somehow harder to sit across from than judgment would have been. He declined the Medal of Honor nomination. He submitted his separation papers, and then he disappeared from every system we had for him. Sloan closed the folder. Until this morning, she said. Until this morning. Hale nodded once. A pilot went down in the Gulf 54 hours ago. Declan Webb's son, Junior, 28 years old, flying the same routes his father flew. Our analysts worked the radar data for 2 days and couldn't resolve the return. He paused. Fletcher looked at it for 10 seconds. The weight of that landed in the room and stayed. He identified the crash site. Coral Reef radar shadow. Frequency signature consistent with a live aircraft in a controlled ditch position. Hale's voice was even. The rescue team is in the water right now because of what he saw this morning. In a parking lot. In coveralls. After you fired him. He said the last part without inflection, which made it worse than if he had said it with anger. Sloan stood and walked to the window that looked down over the shop floor. Below, the technicians moved through the bays in the ordinary rhythm of a Monday morning, and Bay 4 sat empty, the Escalade still on the lift with its transmission partially reassembled, waiting for the man who had been the only one willing to find what was wrong with it. He's Harold Rourke's son, Hale said behind her. She turned. His father and your father built this company together. Harold sold his stake in 1993. Fletcher was 6 years old. Hale looked at her with the patience of a man who has watched people receive difficult information and learned that the best thing to do is stay still while they process it. Fletcher grew up in Denver. He came back to Denver. He applied for a mechanic position at the company his father helped build and used a name that no one here thought to look up. He paused. Whether that was intentional or incidental, I couldn't tell you. But he's been working in this building for 6 years, and the last person in this building who knew who he was died 2 years before he walked through the door. Sloan looked at the window, at the shop floor, at the empty bay. She thought about the way her father used to spend the first 10 minutes of every morning at his desk doing nothing at all. No clipboard, no phone, just the building around him and whatever he had decided to think about that day. She had found it inefficient when she first inherited the office and had not found it that way since. She thought about the way she had walked onto that floor this morning looking for the thing that was wrong and had found it and eliminated it with the efficiency she had trained herself to perform, and how the thing she had eliminated was the only person in the building who was doing the job the way her father would have recognized. "How do I fix this?" she said. It came out quieter than she intended. Hale stood, gathered the folder, and settled it under his arm. "You start by seeing him clearly. Not the coverall. Not the technique that wasn't in your manual." He moved toward the door and stopped. He didn't stay hidden because he was ashamed. He stayed hidden because he was protecting the only thing he had left to protect. He looked back at her once. His daughter drew him a picture every morning before school for 3 years. He kept every one of them. They're in a shoebox under the passenger seat of that truck in your parking lot. He opened the door. "A man who does that isn't hiding from his life, Miss Merritt. He's building one with whatever the previous one left him." He left. Sloane stood alone in the office that used to be her father's and looked at the printed page Darnell had left on the desk. The service record, the gap where a life had folded itself in half and continued. She looked at the security footage still open on her second monitor, frozen on the frame where Fletcher paused at the exit door and looked back at the building. She had watched that pause 4 times now and understood it differently each time. Her phone lit up on the desk, the board chairman's name on the screen. She let it ring. Then it stopped, and 10 seconds later, her assistant appeared in the doorway wearing the expression of someone delivering information they wish they weren't delivering. The video was trending nationally. 3 automotive industry accounts with combined followings in the millions had shared it. The comment sections were uniform in their verdict. A consumer advocacy group had already drafted a statement, and Oz Strickland, her CFO, had sent her a calendar invitation for an emergency board session at 2 o'clock with a subject line that read, simply, "Reputation Management." Sloane looked at the invitation for a long moment. Then she looked at the still frame on her monitor. Fletcher at the exit, one hand on the push bar, looking back at something that had belonged to his family before it belonged to hers. She picked up the folder Hale had left and opened it again to the photograph. Fletcher in his flight suit, visor up, looking straight into the camera in 2017 with the eyes of a man who had not yet carried what he was about to carry. She looked at it the way she had looked at very few things in the 2 years since her father died. Without the clipboard, without the evaluation, without the performance of certainty she had constructed to survive in rooms full of people who were waiting for her to fail. She looked at it like someone who had just been shown the cost of a decision she had made in 4 seconds, and was only now beginning to understand would take considerably longer to answer for. Downstairs in Bay 4, the Escalade sat on the lift with its transmission open and its repair half finished, and no one went near it for the rest of the day. Act 3. The conference room on the 3rd floor of Merritt Automotive had been built for presentations to regional dealers and quarterly reviews with the board. It had a long table that seated 12, a projection screen that descended from the ceiling on a motorized track, and windows that looked north toward the Rockies, which on clear days appeared close enough to touch, and on overcast days disappeared entirely. On this particular Monday, it had been converted, with the efficiency of people who did this kind of thing regularly, into something that resembled a forward operating intelligence cell. 3 laptops networked through a secured Navy satellite uplink, 2 large monitors mounted on portable stands, A topographic overlay of the Gulf of Aden printed on a 6-foot table sheet and waited at the corners with coffee mugs. 4 Navy personnel who moved around the room with the compact purposefulness of people accustomed to working in spaces not designed for them. Fletcher stood at the far end of the table in his coverall and looked at the data without sitting down. He had called Nora's school before getting into the Navy vehicle, arranged for her to go home with Clara's family, and sent Clara's mother a single line she answered in 30 seconds without asking questions. Then he had not looked back at the pharmacy. "Walk me through what you have," he said. The intelligence officer, Lieutenant Cassius Ware, 29, with the specific brand of competence that presents itself as deference while actually being efficiency, pulled the primary display. 54 hours of satellite passes over a 12 nautical mile search grid in the Gulf of Aden, southeast of the Yemeni coastline. Radar returns filtered, cross-referenced, eliminated. What remained after 2 days of analysis was a set of anomalous low-altitude signatures in Sector 3 that the Navy's automated system had tagged as probable debris field. Fletcher looked at the returns for 11 seconds. "That's not a debris field." He pointed to the trailing edge of the primary return without touching the screen. "The frequency shift here, that's rotor drag. Titanium alloy under water load, partially submerged. The return pattern is consistent with a complete airframe in a nose-high ditch attitude." He traced the perimeter of the signature. The reef structure is creating a radar shadow on the port side. That's why the automated filter kept flagging it as debris. The shadow breaks up the return and makes it look fragmentary. He straightened. He put it down in the reef intentionally, nose into the coral to anchor it against the current, which means he had enough control authority on final approach to make a choice. He looked at Ware. "That's not a crash. That's a landing. A bad one, but a landing. He's alive." The room was quiet for 3 seconds, which in a room full of trained professionals was its own form of response. Loring leaned forward. "The tidal model puts the cockpit fully submerged in approximately 8 hours from our current time. 7.5. Fletcher had already done the math. "The reef system in that sector has a faster tidal run than the regional average because of the channel geometry. I flew over it 17 times. The surface pattern changes." He looked at the topographic overlay on the table and found the sector without needing to orient himself. He needs to be out of the airframe before the tide covers the canopy. After that, it's a dive recovery, not a rescue. He looked at Loring. "What's the nearest asset?" "Destroyer is 60 nautical miles out. Rescue swimmer team is already on the helo. Then you have enough time if you move in the next 40 minutes. He stepped back from the table. "Call the grid to the rescue swimmer. Tell him to approach from the northeast quadrant. The reef opens there, and the ditch attitude means the exit hatch is accessible from that vector. Tell him the pilot will be in the cockpit or immediately adjacent. He won't have gone far from the aircraft because he'll know the reef is his only fixed reference point in that current." Ware was already on the radio. Sloane had been standing outside the conference room for 11 minutes before she walked in. She had come up the stairs rather than the elevator, which gave her time to construct something resembling composure. And she had stood outside the glass panel in the door and watched Fletcher work with an objectivity she was trying to maintain and finding increasingly difficult to sustain. He moved through the data the way he had moved through the transmission diagnosis that morning. Without performance, without the signaling of expertise that most people couldn't resist when they had it. He simply saw what was there and said what it meant. The gap between that and what she had done with it at 6:30 this morning was a distance she was not going to be able to paper over with a policy review. She pushed open the door. Fletcher looked up. Whatever she had prepared to say in the stairwell didn't survive the directness of his attention. She set the 2 coffees on the table and sat down across from him, which was not the posture of a CEO conducting a damage control conversation, and both of them knew it. "I was wrong." She said it without the qualified language that wrong usually arrives in. The institutional passive voice, the contextual framing, the acknowledgement of complexity. Just the sentence, flat and load-bearing. Fletcher looked at her for a moment in which she could feel him deciding something. "All right," he said. "That's all? What would you like me to say?" She held his gaze. "I'd like you to tell me I could have handled it differently, and there's a path back from it." He was quiet for a few seconds. When he spoke, it was without meanness, which was somehow more precise than meanness would have been. Whether there's a path back from something isn't usually up to the person who caused it. He picked up the coffee, looked at it briefly, set it down. "Our fathers worked at the same table. I used to sit on the parts counter in this building when I was 6 years old and watch them argue about load ratings for the hydraulic lifts." He looked at her steadily. "I didn't apply for a job here by accident. The room's ambient noise, the laptop fans, the equipment, the distant sound of the shop floor 2 levels below, continued without concern for the weight of what he had just said. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because I didn't come back here to claim anything. I came back because it was the last place I felt like my father was still present somewhere." He turned the coffee cup a quarter rotation on the table. "And because Nora needed a father who came home at the same time every day and wasn't flying over water in the dark." Sloane looked at her hands, then back at him. "Fear is something I know about," she said carefully. "I've been performing certainty in this building for 2 years because the alternative was giving 11 board members a reason to do exactly what they're trying to do anyway." Fletcher looked at her with the attention of someone who is listening past the words. "Performing certainty and having it are different problems," he said. "One of them you can fix." Before she could respond, Ware's radio produced a burst of static and then a voice, compressed, intermittent, eroded by distance and interference, but unmistakably coherent. A pilot's voice, trained to stay level under conditions designed to destabilize it. The words came through in fragments, but the essential ones were clear enough. Alive. Position. Holding. The room straightened around that transmission like a building reorienting to true north. Fletcher closed his eyes for 2 seconds. When he opened them, the expression on his face was not relief, exactly. It was the thing that lives on the other side of relief, the thing you get to feel only after you have already survived not feeling it for a long time. He looked at the coordinate on the monitor, and then he looked at nothing in particular for a moment, and Sloane, who had spent 2 years learning to read rooms and the people in them, looked away and gave him that moment without comment or witness. Declan Webb Jr. was 28 years old. His father had been 42 when he died, holding a perimeter line in the dark, so that an aircraft with 14 men in it could get off the ground. Fletcher had known the senior Webb for 8 years, had eaten at his table in Virginia Beach, had taught him a pressure differential technique for rapid field diagnosis of rotary hydraulics, had stood at parade rest at his memorial and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. He had not known until Admiral Hale told him this morning that Webb's son had followed his father into naval aviation. He had not known, and the not knowing felt like its own kind of failure, even though it wasn't, even though it was simply the consequence of having disappeared from a life that continued without him. The rescue swimmer team reached the grid coordinates 40 minutes later. The confirmation came through clean and unambiguous. Pilot recovered, vital signs stable, 2 broken ribs and dehydration, conscious and talking. The room exhaled collectively, the kind of exhalation that releases something that has been held compressed for a long time and cannot be held any longer. Ware looked at Fletcher across the table with the expression of someone who has just watched a thing happen that he will be explaining to people for years. Fletcher nodded once, minimally, the way people acknowledge facts that are true and don't require amplification. Then Oz Strickland walked through the conference room door with a tablet in his hand and a face that had arranged itself into the specific configuration of concern that Sloan had learned in 24 months of working alongside him was the expression he wore when he had already made a decision and was about to dress it as a consultation. He looked at the room, the equipment, the Navy personnel, Fletcher in his coverall at the head of the table, and he arranged all of it into a narrative with the speed of someone who had been constructing that narrative in advance. Sloan. His voice carried the practiced weight of someone who had learned that gravity of tone could substitute for gravity of argument. The board is asking for a statement. We have a situation developing externally that needs to be managed before close of business. The situation, Sloan said, is that a pilot is alive because of work done in this building today. Oz smiled with the portion of his face responsible for smiling. Of course, and that's a compelling human story. But the external narrative right now is about liability. A terminated employee with classified military records having unsupervised access to a corporate facility and Navy equipment. Legal has concerns. Fletcher had not looked at Oz since he entered the room. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the title model. He made a small notation on the pad in front of him and set the pen down with the deliberateness of someone choosing not to use it as anything other than a pen. Sloan held Oz's eye. Schedule the board call for 4. I'll be there. Oz lingered for a beat longer than necessary, which was its own form of message, then withdrew. The door closed. Nobody in the room said anything about what had just happened. They didn't need to. Darnell Pruitt appeared in the doorway 20 minutes later with 3 sandwiches from the deli on Market Street, and the expression of a man who has decided that if the institution is failing a person, the least available remedy is lunch. He set them on the corner of the table without explanation and left without being thanked, which was his preference. Fletcher ate half of one standing at the window, looking north at the Rockies. The overcast had broken in the early afternoon, and the peaks were visible now, white above the tree line, indifferent to everything at their base. Sloan sat at the far end of the table with her coffee going cold and watched him. She had spent 2 years learning to read rooms and the people in them, and she understood in this moment that she had been reading him wrong since the moment he stood up from under the Escalade. Same person she had looked at that morning, same material. She had just been looking for the wrong thing in it. "You have a daughter," she said, not a question. "Nora." He didn't turn from the window. 8 years old. She has her mother's judgment about people. A pause. "She would have told me you weren't evil. Just scared." Sloan absorbed that. "And what would you have told her?" He turned then, just slightly, enough to look at her from the corner of his vision. That she was probably right, and that being scared and being wrong aren't the same thing, but they can produce the same result. He turned back to the window. "She's going to ask me tomorrow why I'm not going to work. I'm going to have to figure out what to tell her." "Tell her it's temporary," Sloan said, and the firmness in her voice surprised her more than it surprised him. He looked at her fully then, the first time since the conversation had moved from the transactional to whatever this was. He looked at her with the evaluation of someone who has learned to distinguish between what people say and what they mean, and has found the gap between the two to be the most reliable indicator of character available. He looked at her long enough that she felt it, not uncomfortably, but the way you feel a temperature change, as information. "That's not your decision right now," he said. "That's Oz Strickland's and 6 other people in a room at 4 o'clock. "No," she said, "it isn't." And she meant the agreement and the refusal simultaneously, and he understood both. The afternoon moved. Ware's team began their debrief and documentation. The equipment was broken down with the practiced efficiency of people who set up and strike in unfamiliar locations regularly, and the conference room gradually returned to the proportions of a room built for dealer presentations and quarterly reviews. Fletcher remained through the process, answering questions when Ware had them, providing the additional route data and frequency signature analysis that the formal record required. He did it without ceremony, without the awareness of being observed that most people carry in those situations. He did it the way he did everything, as if the work was the only relevant fact and all other context was atmospheric. At 3:15, Nora called. He stepped into the corridor to take it, and Sloane, who was still at the conference table with her laptop open, heard through the closed door only the register of his voice, lower than his working voice, slower, with a quality of attention that she recognized as the specific quality of attention a person reserves for 1 or 2 people in their lives at the absolute most. She could not hear the words. She didn't need to. She understood the voice. She thought about what Hale had told her. The shoebox under the passenger seat. 3 years of drawings every morning before school. She thought about that and about the way her father used to stand at the north-facing window on quiet mornings with his coffee, not reviewing paperwork but simply watching the mountains, as if the building only made sense when you remembered what it was surrounded by. She understood for the first time in 2 years of running this company that she and Fletcher Rourke were both operating in spaces built by people who were no longer in them, and that the difference between them was that he had found a way to be inhabited by that fact rather than flattened by it. He came back into the conference room at 3:22, sat down, picked up the pen, made one more notation on the pad. She wanted to know if the pilot was okay, he said, without looking up. "What did you tell her?" "That he was. That sometimes things break, and the most useful thing you can do is find where it broke and fix it." He set the pen down. "She said that's what you do with people too." He looked up. "She's 8. She says things like that." Sloane found that she didn't have a response that was adequate to the moment, so she said nothing, which was the right choice and one she had not always been capable of making. At 3:58, her phone lit up with Oz Strickland's name. She looked at it. Then she looked at Fletcher, who was looking at the Rockies through the north-facing window with the attention of a man who has learned to take the measure of things that are going to be there after everything else changes. She declined the call. She would be in the board meeting at 4. She would sit at the head of the table, and she would listen to Oz construct his narrative, and she would watch 6 men decide whether the past 2 years of her decisions had earned her the right to make the next one. She knew what was coming. She had known since the moment she watched Oz's face arrange itself in the conference room doorway. She also knew, with the certainty of something that had clarified over the course of a single Monday, that she was going to walk into that room differently than she had walked into any room in 2 years. Not with the performance of certainty, but with something that felt quieter and considerably more durable. The board meeting would happen. What happened after it was another question. Downstairs in Bay 4, the Escalade was still on the lift. Nobody had touched it all day. The repair was half finished, the valve body exposed, the correct parts laid out on the mat in the order Fletcher had arranged them that morning before Sloane Merritt had walked across the concrete in her gray suit and changed the shape of the day. The other technicians had worked around it, giving the bay a wide berth in the unspoken way that people give space to things that carry weight they can feel but haven't been authorized to address. Darnell Pruitt stood at the bay entrance at 4:03 and looked at the open transmission and the tools on the mat and the half-finished work of a man who had been removed from the middle of doing it correctly. He picked up a shop rag from the bench, folded it with the care of someone who has been folding shop rags for 30 years, and set it on top of the toolbox. Then he turned off the light in Bay 4 and went home. The 4 o'clock board meeting lasted 51 minutes. Sloane knew its shape before she walked in, had known it the way you know the weather before you open the door, from the pressure change and the quality of the light coming under it. Oz Strickland had sent a pre-meeting summary to all 7 board members at 3:45, which was 15 minutes before the scheduled start, which meant he had written it before he called her, which meant the call had not been a consultation. It had been a notification, dressed as one. She read the summary in the elevator. It was 4 paragraphs of clean, reasonable-sounding language that built, with the architecture of something constructed rather than observed, toward a single conclusion. That the events of the day constituted a reputational and legal exposure that required immediate corrective action, and that corrective action meant the formal termination of Fletcher Rourke's association with Merritt Automotive, a public statement distancing the company from the Navy operation conducted on its premises, and an internal review of hiring protocols that had allowed, the word Oz had chosen was allowed, not failed to prevent, an individual with a classified service record to work in a client-facing facility without disclosure. The word allowed was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and all of it was dishonest. She walked into the boardroom and sat at the head of the table and let Oz present for 18 minutes without interrupting him, which he had not expected, and which therefore cost him the momentum he had built. When he finished, she asked 3 questions, each of which required him to acknowledge a fact his summary had elected not to include: that Fletcher's technique had identified a transmission fault 3 other technicians had missed, that the Navy operation had resulted in a confirmed pilot recovery, and that the original termination had been conducted without a performance review, a warning, or any documentation of prior issues. Oz answered each question with the smoothness of someone who had prepared for the questions and had decided that smoothness was an adequate substitute for honesty. The board listened. General Boyd Kessler, 71 years old and occupying the corner seat he had occupied for 9 years, listened with his hands folded on the table and his eyes moving between Oz and Sloane with the patience of a man who had watched a great many briefings and learned to distinguish between the ones that were informing him and the ones that were managing him. The vote was 5-3. Formal termination, public statement by close of business. Sloane looked at the result, and then looked at Oz, and then looked at General Kessler, who was looking at the table with the specific expression of a man who has cast a vote he is already revising his opinion of. She thanked the board for their time and left. Adieu. AC 4. She did not go back to the conference room. She went to the stairwell, which was the only location in the building without a camera in her line of sight, and she stood on the landing between the 2nd and 3rd floors, and let the fluorescent hum of the overhead light be the only sound for 90 seconds. Then she went back upstairs and found Fletcher still at the conference table, alone now, the Navy personnel having cleared out, his notepad in front of him and the pen set down beside it, with the finality of something completed. He looked at her face and read it in approximately 2 seconds, which she should have anticipated. 5-3, she said. He nodded, not surprised, not performing the absence of surprise, just receiving information he had already calculated the probability of. Kessler? He asked. He voted with the majority. Fletcher was quiet for a moment. He knows what ironclad was. He was in that world long enough to know. He looked at the notepad. He voted yes anyway. He didn't look comfortable doing it. Comfort's not the same as conviction. He stood, folded the notepad, tucked the pen into his breast pocket. A man who votes against what he believes because the room expects it. That's not a bad man. That's a man who hasn't decided yet what his beliefs are worth. He looked at her. He'll decide eventually. People usually do when the cost gets specific enough. Sloane watched him collect the few items he had accumulated over the course of the day. The notepad, the pen, a paper coffee cup that had been empty for 2 hours. Small objects. A man who had learned not to accumulate things he couldn't carry. "I'm going to fight the board decision," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That's going to cost you. I know what it's going to cost. Do you?" Not a challenge. An actual question, asked with the care of someone who has made calculations about cost that turned out to be wrong and understands what that error produces downstream. She met his eyes. "My father built this company with your father by being the kind of person who didn't measure the cost before deciding what was right. Then he spent 20 years measuring the cost of everything and calling it leadership." She paused. "I've been doing the same thing for 2 years, and I thought it was working. And today, I watched you sit in that room and find a man alive in the Gulf of Aden in 10 seconds, and I understood that I have been optimizing for the wrong variable." The stairwell hum from 2 floors down was the only sound. Fletcher looked at her for a long moment with the expression she was beginning to recognize as his version of reassessment. Not warm exactly, but not its absence either. Something more precise than warmth. Recognition of a specific kind. "Your father and my father argued about everything except the things that mattered," he said. On the things that mattered, they were identical. He picked up the coffee cup. "You're not performing certainty right now." "No. That's different from this morning." "I know." He nodded once with the economy of a man who does not use more gesture than the moment requires. Then he dropped the coffee cup in the trash by the door and walked out of the conference room, and Sloane stood in the space he had occupied and understood that whatever was going to happen next was going to require her to be a different version of herself than the version that had walked across the shop floor at 6:30 that morning, and that becoming that version was not going to be comfortable and was not going to be fast and was not going to be survivable if she treated it as a performance rather than a reckoning. Downstairs, Fletcher retrieved his military green toolbox from the spot where he had left it, beside the exit door, against the wall, out of the path of foot traffic. Because even in the act of being removed from a place, he had taken care not to inconvenience anyone on his way out. He carried it to the truck, loaded it into the bed, sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. The shoebox was under the passenger seat. He didn't look at it. He knew it was there the way he knew where everything was, from the specific gravity of having placed it and not moved it. He started the engine. The truck turned over with the sound of an engine that has been maintained with more attention than the body around it would suggest. Because it had been, because Fletcher Rourke did not neglect the mechanical things in his care, because neglecting them had consequences that extended beyond the machine itself. He pulled out of the Merritt parking lot onto the street and drove north through Denver in the early evening traffic, and the Rockies were still visible to the west, holding the last of the afternoon light on their upper faces the way mountains hold light, without intention, without preference, simply because they are large enough and positioned correctly, and the light has nowhere else to go. He picked Nora up from Clara's house at 5:47. She came down the front walk in her backpack and her winter coat with the broken zipper pull he kept meaning to replace. And she climbed into the passenger seat and buckled herself in and looked at him with the direct assessment that had been her first and most consistent mode of engaging with the world since she was approximately 3 years old. "Did the pilot get found?" she asked. "He did." She nodded with the satisfaction of someone receiving confirmation of something they had already decided was true. Then she looked at him more carefully, the way she looked at him when the surface answer and the actual situation were not the same thing. "Are you okay?" Fletcher pulled away from the curb. The evening light came through the windshield at the low angle that meant the day was almost done. "I'm working on it," he said, which was more honest than fine and less complicated than the truth, and which Nora received with the equanimity of a child who has learned to trust the process her father describes even when she cannot see all of its components. She reached over and turned on the radio, found a station playing something with a steady rhythm and acceptable volume, and then looked out the passenger window at Denver passing in the early dark, and Fletcher drove north through the city that his father had helped build something in, that he had left and returned to, that had taken him in under a name nobody looked up and given him 6 years of ordinary mornings and a bay number and a place to be, when being somewhere quiet was the only thing that kept the rest of it from collapsing inward. The city did not know any of that. Cities don't. They simply continue, indifferent and complete, full of people carrying things that don't show from the outside, moving through intersections and stoplights, and the accumulated ordinary architecture of lives that look like one thing and are entirely another. Nora fell asleep before they reached the apartment. Fletcher carried her up the stairs without waking her, which he had done enough times that he had developed a specific technique for managing the door handle with one hand and her weight redistributed across both arms, and he had never once found this remarkable, which was its own form of love. The kind that does not require an audience or a name. He tucked her in, stood in the doorway of her room for a moment in the dark. On the refrigerator in the kitchen, held by a strawberry-shaped magnet, was this morning's drawing. A helicopter, rendered in green crayon with the specific interpretive confidence of a child who draws what she means rather than what she sees, flying over something that might have been mountains or might have been waves. Nora had labeled it in her careful second-grade print, Dad's Sky. Fletcher stood in the kitchen and looked at it for a long time. Then he sat down at the table and opened the notepad to a clean page and began, slowly and without drama, to write. The article went live at 7:14 the following morning. Fletcher found it the way he found most things he would have preferred not to find, indirectly, through a consequence, rather than the thing itself. Clara's mother sent a text at 7:42 while he was making Nora's breakfast. A single line with a screenshot attached and the kind of brevity that indicated she was not sure what to say, and had decided that saying less was safer than saying more. He read the screenshot standing at the kitchen counter with the egg still on the burner. The headline was clean and surgical in the way that headlines are when someone has spent time on them. Merritt Automotive, Hero Hire or Liability Shield. Questions surround terminated employee with classified military record. The byline was a name he didn't recognize. The sourcing was described as a senior company official speaking on condition of anonymity, which was the grammatical structure that meant someone had made a deliberate choice and wanted credit for the outcome without accountability for the method. The article itself was 400 words of carefully arranged implication. It did not say Fletcher had done anything wrong. It was considerably more sophisticated than that. It suggested, through the architecture of its questions rather than the content of its answers, that a company facing reputational pressure following a viral termination video might have motivations beyond simple justice in its response to that video, that a man with a classified service record working under conditions of apparent anonymity raised questions worth examining, and that the Navy operation conducted on merit premises without prior authorization from the company's legal department represented an exposure that shareholders and customers alike deserved to understand. It was, Fletcher understood, a document designed to make the truth feel complicated. Whoever had written the questions had been given the right information to make them land. He turned off the burner. Nora came into the kitchen in her school clothes, assessed his face with the efficiency she had developed for exactly this purpose, and sat down at the table. "Is it bad?" she asked. He set her breakfast in front of her. "It's manageable." She looked at him. "That's what you say when it's bad, but you don't want me to worry." He sat down across from her. The morning light came through the kitchen window at the angle that hit the refrigerator and illuminated the green crayon helicopter and the careful second-grade letters of Dad's sky. He looked at it for a moment. Some people are trying to make a complicated story out of something that isn't that complicated, he said. It happens. The truth is slower than the story, but it usually gets there. Nora considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things. Mrs. Patterson says the truth always wins eventually. Mrs. Patterson is correct, but eventually could be a long time. Yes, he said, it could. She ate her breakfast. He watched her and thought about the article and about the phrase senior company official and about the specific vocabulary Oz Strickland had used in the boardroom the previous afternoon. The way certain words had arrived too quickly, too formed, as if they had been rehearsed in a different room before being deployed in that one. He walked Nora to the corner where the school bus stopped. The November morning was sharp and still, the kind of cold that clarifies rather than oppresses, and the Rockies to the west were fully visible in the early light, white and definitive. She hugged him at the corner, the full-body hug of a child who has not yet learned to make affection efficient, and got on the bus without looking back, which was something he had decided early on to read as confidence rather than indifference, because the alternative interpretation was not useful. He stood at the corner after the bus pulled away and did not check his phone for 4 minutes. Then he checked it. 14 missed calls. 6 from numbers he didn't recognize, which meant press. 3 from a number identified as Merit Corporate, which meant Sloan or her assistant or both. 2 from Admiral Hale's office. 1 from a Colorado Springs number he didn't recognize. 1 from Darnell Pruitt, which was the only one he returned. Darnell answered on the second ring. He didn't offer a greeting. "I know who wrote the article," he said. Fletcher waited. Oz Strickland has a personal email account he uses for correspondence he doesn't want on the company's server. He's not careful about where he accesses it. He used the conference room laptop 2 months ago when his own machine was being serviced. IT keeps access logs. A pause. "I have a nephew in IT." Fletcher stood on the sidewalk in the cold morning and processed the information with the speed and quietness of someone who has spent a long time learning to receive bad news without letting it show on the outside. How long has he been building this? Long enough that it wasn't opportunistic. Darnell's voice was flat in the way of someone delivering a structural assessment rather than an emotional one. The article source matches 3 email threads from the past 6 weeks. He was waiting for something to use. You walking out that gate yesterday morning was just the occasion. Sloane needs to see this. I'm taking it to her at 9. A brief pause. Fletcher. He's been in contact with Ridgeline Auto Group. There are 4 exchanges in the archive discussing terms. He's not trying to embarrass the company. He's trying to devalue it before a sale. The cold air sat on the back of Fletcher's neck. Does the board know? The board voted 5-3 yesterday to support his narrative. Darnell let that sit for a moment. Some of them may not know what they supported. Fletcher looked at the corner where Nora's bus had been and was not anymore. General Kessler voted with the majority. I know. He won't do it twice. Fletcher said it not as a prediction, but as an assessment, the way he would assess a structural fault. Not what he wanted to be true, but what the material suggested. Get the evidence to Sloane before the 9 o'clock. Everything. The email threads, the Ridgeline correspondence, the access logs, all of it. He paused. Don't filter it. She needs the full picture. Already printed, Darnell said, and ended the call. Fletcher walked back to the apartment through the sharp November morning and sat at the kitchen table with his notepad open to the page he had been writing on the night before. The page contained a list, not of grievances, not of plans, but of technical observations. 7 items, each described in the precise shorthand he used for fault documentation, each referencing a specific procedure in the Merit Service Manual and the specific way that procedure produced inferior outcomes compared to field-verified alternatives. He had started the list at 11:15 the previous night and finished it at 2:47 in the morning, working from memory and from the 6 years of daily observation that were as much a part of his operational knowledge as anything he had learned in 14 years of Navy service. The list was 47 items long. He had stopped at 7 because 7 was what he could document precisely enough to withstand examination. 7 was the number that was true rather than the number that was comprehensive. And truth was the only currency that would be worth anything in the room where this was going to have to be resolved. He turned to a clean page and kept writing. Sloane called at 9:43. He let it ring twice before answering, not from hesitation, but from the particular discipline of never picking up a call in the middle of a sentence, even a sentence on a notepad in an empty apartment. Darnell came in. Her voice had the quality of someone who has received information and is still integrating its dimensions. I've seen the emails. All of them? All of them. A pause in which he could hear her making a decision. The Ridgeline correspondence goes back 9 months. He's been positioning himself as the facilitating party for an acquisition. He told them the current leadership was unstable. His word was unstable. And that the board could be moved with the right pressure at the right moment. Yesterday was the right moment. Yesterday was the right moment. Her voice was steady, but with the particular density of steadiness that is maintained rather than natural. He gave the article exactly enough to imply wrongdoing without saying anything actionable. He knew I'd be in the board meeting managing the fallout while he managed the board. What does General Kessler say? A beat. I haven't told him yet. I wanted to speak to you first. Fletcher set the pen down. Why? Because you're the person in this situation with the least obligation to behave well, and you've been behaving better than anyone else in it. And I wanted to know how you're thinking about it before I decide how to move. He was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was very still. The green crayon helicopter on the refrigerator caught the mid-morning light at a different angle than it had at breakfast. Same drawing, different illumination, which was not an observation he pursued further. "Don't go to the board with the ridgeline material yet," he said. "Not until you know how Kessler will land. If you show that evidence to a room that still contains Oz and the majority that voted with him yesterday, he'll characterize it as retaliation and manufacture enough ambiguity to survive it." He picked the pen back up. "Kessler first, privately. Show him the access logs and the correspondence and let him reach his own conclusion. A man who voted against his convictions once will overcorrect when he understands what he was used for." Sloan was silent for 3 seconds. "You're telling me to build a coalition before I show my hand. I'm telling you the difference between being right and winning is usually sequencing." Another pause, longer. "Where did you learn to think like that? 14 years of mission planning in rooms where the wrong sequence got people killed." He said it without weight, as a fact rather than a memory, which was the only way he had found to carry those years in ordinary conversation. "The skill transfers." He heard her exhale, not dramatically, just the sound of someone releasing something they had been holding in a particular configuration and letting it settle into a different one. "The board reconvenes at 2 o'clock. Oz has already sent an agenda." "What's on it?" "A resolution to issue the public statement distancing the company from," and I am quoting, "the unauthorized use of corporate facilities for activities unrelated to company operations." She said it with the flatness of someone reading a thing that is designed to make a true thing sound like a liability. "And a formal vote to refer the hiring protocol failure to an external review committee, which would effectively freeze any reinstatement conversation for 60 to 90 days. Fletcher looked at the notepad, at the 7 items. "I'll be there at 2, he said. "You're not an employee." "I know." He said it without apology. "I'm Harold Rourke's son. This company has my family's name in its foundation documents. I don't need an employee badge to walk through that door." The silence that followed was not empty. It had the texture of something being recognized, not agreed with yet, not fully processed, but seen clearly for the first time. "I'll have Darnell leave your name at the front," she said. He was at the Merritt building by 11. Not for the board meeting. That was 3 hours away. He went because the Escalade in Bay 4 was still on the lift with its transmission open and its repair unfinished. And the customer had called that morning, and the work was his work, and leaving it undone was not something he was architecturally capable of. Darnell met him at the side entrance with a visitor badge and the expression of a man who has decided that the rules of a situation have been superseded by the requirements of it. The shop floor went quiet when Fletcher walked through, not the hostile quiet of the previous morning, but the watchful quiet of people who have spent 24 hours revising their understanding of what they had witnessed. He went to Bay 4, turned the light on, looked at the transmission, at the tools on the mat in the order he had left them. At the shop rag Darnell had folded and placed on top of the toolbox. He put on a fresh set of gloves, picked up where he had stopped, and finished the repair in 41 minutes. He test cycled the transmission through its full range 4 times. He documented the fault, the method, and the resolution on the service card in his standard shorthand. He returned the tools to the toolbox in their designated positions and closed the lid. He lowered the Escalade off the lift and moved it to the finished bay. One of the younger technicians, a 23-year-old named Perry who had been at Merritt for 8 months and had a habit of watching Fletcher work from a distance without acknowledging that he was doing it, walked past the bay 3 times in 41 minutes. On the 3rd pass, he stopped. "That pressure gauge thing," Perry said, "the diagnostic technique, is that something you could show someone?" Fletcher looked at him. "Yes." "Does it work on more than transmissions?" Any hydraulic system with pressure differential as a diagnostic variable, which is most of them. Perry nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are filing information into a category they didn't previously have. He started to walk away, then stopped. "For what it's worth," he said without turning around, "everyone in this shop knew the Escalade needed you to finish it. Nobody touched it." He walked away before Fletcher could respond, which spared them both the difficulty of knowing what to do with the statement. At 1:15, Fletcher went to the men's room on the second floor, washed the transmission fluid from his hands with the methodical thoroughness of someone who has washed grease from their hands 10,000 times and developed a sequence for it, and looked at himself in the mirror with the neutral assessment of a man taking inventory. He was 38 years old. He had been 31 when Ironclad happened, 32 when Claire died, 32 when he drove into Denver in a truck with a shoebox under the passenger seat and a 2-year-old in a car seat and no plan beyond the next 24 hours. He had built 6 years of next 24 hours into something that looked, from certain angles, like a life. He had done it without asking for anything from anyone, which was something he had believed was a virtue, and was beginning to understand was also a wound that had never been properly examined. The man in the mirror looked back at him and offered no particular wisdom, which was appropriate. He dried his hands, folded the paper towel, dropped it in the bin with the precision of someone who does small things the right way, because the small things are the practice for everything else. At 1:47, Nora called from the school nurse's office. The nurse's name was Mrs. Gallagher. She came on the line first, professional and calm, and told him that Nora had experienced a moderate asthma episode during afternoon recess, that the school's emergency inhaler had been administered, that Nora was comfortable and breathing normally, and that he should come when he was able, the "when he was able" containing the specific inflection that meant sooner. Fletcher was in the truck by 1:49. He drove to the school with the controlled urgency of someone who has learned that panicking in a vehicle helps nothing, and that the only useful response to a crisis while operating machinery is to operate the machinery correctly and arrive intact. His hands were steady on the wheel. His breathing was regulated with the conscious evenness of a technique rather than a natural state. He did not exceed the speed limit by more than 8 miles per hour. Nora was in the nurse's office on the cot with the crinkly paper cover, her backpack on the floor beside her, and her color restored to its normal range. She looked up when he came in and said, with the matter-of-fact clarity that was her primary mode, "I'm fine. My inhaler ran out." He sat on the chair beside the cot and looked at her. Her chest was rising and falling at a normal rate. Her lips were their correct color. He had cataloged every indicator of respiratory distress in an 8-year-old with the thoroughness of someone who had been managing this alone for 6 years and could not afford to miss anything. "I know you're fine," he said. "I'm checking anyway." "You always check anyway." "Yes." She looked at him with the directness that came from Claire. The same angle of attention, the same quality of seeing the thing rather than the surface of it. "You had somewhere to be at too," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. "I had somewhere to be right now." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Mom would say the same thing." He held very still. The nurse's office had the institutional hum of a room that has been the site of hundreds of small crises and resolutions, and it held that history in its walls, the way all rooms hold what has happened in them. Fletcher sat in it and felt the familiar weight of Claire's absence with the specificity that certain moments, not the grand ones, but the small ones, the ones that required her presence for their full meaning, still produced after 6 years. "She would," he said. Nora reached over and took his hand with the unself-consciousness of a child who has not yet learned that comfort is something that requires justification, and held it with the steady, uncomplicated grip of someone who knows that the grip itself is the whole of what she means. They sat like that for a while. At 2:17, his phone showed a text from Darnell. Board meeting delayed to 4. Kessler asked for the postponement. No reason given. Fletcher looked at the message. Then he looked at Nora, who had fallen into the light sleep of someone whose body had worked hard and needed to recover. He looked at the shape of her breathing, steady and even and present. He put the phone in his pocket. He would be at Merritt at 4. He would bring the notepad and the 7 items and the truth, which was slower than the story, but had better staying power and did not require the assistance of anonymous sources. He would walk into the building that his father had helped build, and he would say what was true in a room full of people who had various investments in it not being true, and he would do it not because he expected it to be sufficient, but because it was the only move available that he could make without diminishing something he intended to leave intact. The window in the nurse's office looked west. The Rockies were still there, unchanged as they always were, as they would be after all of this had resolved into whatever it was going to resolve into, with the impartiality of things that have been holding light for longer than any of the human situations at their base have existed. Fletcher looked at them for a moment with the attention he reserved for things that were going to be there after he was finished with whatever he was in the middle of. Then he looked at his daughter sleeping in the cot with the crinkly paper cover, and he understood with the quiet certainty of something that required no examination that the calculation he had been running since 7:14 that morning, the cost, the exposure, the risk to Nora's stability and his own, had already resolved itself in the only direction it was ever going to go. Some things were not calculations. They were just the shape of a person, visible when the pressure was sufficient to reveal it. He stayed until she woke up. He dropped Nora at Clara's house at 3:30. She had slept for 40 minutes in the nurse's office and woken up clear-eyed and matter-of-fact in the way she always woke from the recovery sleep after an episode, as if the event had already been filed and what remained was simply the next thing. She ate the crackers Mrs. Gallagher provided. She retrieved her backpack from the floor and checked that her homework folder was in it. She told Fletcher she was fine 3 times, each time with marginally more emphasis, which was her method of indicating that his continued assessment was appreciated but no longer diagnostically necessary. In the truck on the way to Clara's, she was quiet for 2 blocks and then said, "Are you going to get your job back?" He kept his eyes on the road. "I'm going to try to do something more useful than that." She looked at him. "What's more useful than getting your job back? Making sure the place your grandfather helped build is still worth working at." He glanced at her. "The job comes after that, or it doesn't, but the order matters." She considered this with the seriousness she brought to most things he said when he said them like that, without simplification, treating her as someone capable of holding the actual shape of a thing. Then she nodded once, in the way that meant she had filed it and would return to it later when she had processed it more fully. It was Claire's nod, the same angle, the same quality of deferral. He had stopped being surprised by these moments and had started simply receiving them. At Clara's door, he knelt to her level. "I'll be there by 7. I know." She looked at him with the direct assessment that was her default mode. "Don't be scared." "I'm not scared." She raised an eyebrow, which was also Claire's. "Dad." He held her gaze for a moment. "Fear is just another instrument," he said. "You don't ignore it. You fly through it." She seemed to find this adequate. She hugged him, the full body kind, and went inside. He did not sleep that night. He had known, when he said it to Nora in the truck, that it was true, that the job was not the point and never had been, that the point was the building and what the building represented and what it owed to two men who had shaken hands over a workbench in 1988 and decided to build something that lasted. He had known it the way he knew most things about himself. Not from reflection, but from the way his body had already made the decision before his mind caught up to it. What he had not expected was the box. It was under the bed, not the shoebox in the truck, which held Nora's drawings and belonged to the mornings, but the other box, the one he had carried from San Diego and placed under every bed in every apartment since, and never once opened. He pulled it out at 11:47, sitting on the floor of the bedroom with Nora breathing steadily in the next room, and he set it in front of him and looked at it for a while before he touched the lid. Inside, the photographs he already knew by inventory, the San Diego years. Claire in the hospital, 2 days after Nora was born, the exhaustion and something beyond exhaustion in her face that he had understood even then was not only from the birth. The last photograph. Claire in the chair by the window in the apartment on Coronado. Thin. The light at an angle that turned her hair the color it had been when they met. And she was looking at something outside the frame and smiling at it, and whatever she was looking at he had never been able to determine and had stopped trying. Beneath the photographs, in the bottom right corner, an envelope he had not placed there himself. His name on the outside in her handwriting, which had changed by the end. Smaller, more careful. The hand of someone managing a reduced quantity of available precision. He had not known it was there. She had put it there without telling him, which was characteristic, which was the kind of thing she did because she understood him well enough to know that knowing in advance would have made him incapable of ever opening the box at all. He opened it. The letter was 3 pages. She had written it in pieces, he could tell. Different pressures on the pen. A date at the top of the second page that was 11 days after the first. She had taken her time with it. She had thought about what he would need. Fletch, I know you're reading this because something got hard enough that you went looking for something to hold on to. I know you because you are the most stubborn person I have ever loved, and also the most honest one. And those two things together mean you wouldn't open this until you needed it more than you needed to protect yourself from it. I want to tell you about the morning you left for Ironclad. You were already in the truck when you came back inside. You said you forgot your sunglasses, but I knew you didn't forget anything. You never forgot anything. You came back because you needed one more minute. You stood in the kitchen and you held Nora for 40 seconds and you didn't say anything, and neither did I, and that was the whole of it. That was the marriage in those 40 seconds. Whatever is happening right now, I need you to understand that you were never running from your life. You were carrying it forward the only way that was available. Nora knows that even if she doesn't have the words for it yet, she will. She has your stubbornness and my vocabulary, and that combination is going to be something to witness. Don't be invisible anymore. Not for her. Not for the people who need what you know. The world is smaller without Ironside in it. I love you. I loved you from the morning with the sunglasses. I love you from wherever I am now, which I choose to believe is somewhere with good light. Come back. He sat on the floor with the letter for a long time. The building settled around him in its nighttime sounds. Nora turned over in her sleep. The refrigerator held its drawings in the kitchen, all the helicopters, all the careful print. He folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope. He put the envelope in his breast pocket, which was where he would keep it from that point forward. Then he stood, washed his face at the kitchen sink, sat down at the table, and opened the notepad to a clean page. He wrote until 3 in the morning. Tatitobar. I feel waiting. Acid 5. He sat in the truck for 30 seconds. Then he started the engine and drove to Merritt Automotive for what might have been the last time or might not have been. And he held both possibilities at the same distance because the distance was what allowed him to think clearly. The building looked the same from the outside, which was the irrelevance of buildings. They do not register the weight of what is being decided inside them. The parking lot held the same configuration of vehicles it held every weekday at this hour. The north-facing windows caught the late afternoon sky. Fletcher parked in the back corner where the security light had been burned out for 6 weeks and walked to the entrance with the notepad under his arm and nothing else. Darnell was in the lobby. He handed Fletcher a visitor badge without ceremony and fell into step beside him toward the elevator. Kessler arrived at 3:58, he said. He went directly to Sloane's office. He was in there for 22 minutes. He came out carrying the folder. Fletcher pressed the elevator button. Which folder? The one I gave Sloane this morning. Darnell looked at the elevator doors. The full one. The elevator arrived. They rode it to the 3rd floor in the comfortable silence of 2 people who have been in enough difficult situations together. Even a shared situation of 6 years' duration, even a parallel one, to understand that silence before a hard thing is not absence of communication, but a different form of it. The boardroom was the same room it always was, and also not. The configuration of people around the table had shifted in the way that configurations shift when the balance of information in a room has changed since the last time it was assembled. Oz Strickland sat in his usual position with his tablet and his folder, and his face arranged in its standard configuration of competent authority, but the configuration had a quality of maintenance to it now. It was being held rather than inhabited. Sloane sat at the head of the table with her hands folded and her face in the stillness that Fletcher had identified on his first day as armor and was now able to distinguish from the real thing. And what she was wearing today was closer to the real thing. General Boyd Kessler sat in his corner seat with the folder on the table in front of him, closed, with his hands resting on top of it in the particular posture of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the appropriate moment to act on it. Fletcher took the chair at the far end of the table, not the foot exactly, but the position that put him at maximum distance from Oz and direct sightline to Sloane, and set the notepad in front of him and did not open it. Oz looked at him with the smooth surprise of someone who had calculated various outcomes and had not assigned significant probability to this one. "This is a closed board session," he said. "Visitors aren't... Harold Rourke's name is in this company's foundation documents," Fletcher said. He said it without elevation, the way he said most things, as a fact that existed regardless of how it was received. "I'm his son. I have 47 years of standing in this room, and I'm using 6 minutes of it." He looked at Oz. "You can time me." The room absorbed this. Oz opened his mouth and closed it, which was the first time Fletcher had observed him do either of those things in sequence. Sloane did not look at Fletcher. She looked at the table, but the corner of her mouth moved in a way that she did not attempt to prevent, which was its own form of communication. Fletcher opened the notepad. 7 items, he said. Each one is a documented procedural fault in the current Merit Service Manual. Each one has a field-verified alternative with a higher accuracy rate, lower liability exposure, and faster resolution time. I've been observing these faults for 6 years. I documented them last night. He turned the notepad so the facing board members could see the page. Item 1. He looked up briefly. Is the valve body diagnostic procedure. The one that missed a scored bore on a customer's Escalade for 3 days. The customer's family drives that vehicle on the interstate. He let that land for exactly 1 second. Item 2 is the torque verification sequence on the Class C brake assembly. The current protocol produces an 18% false completion rate. The field alternative produces 4%. He moved through the remaining 5 items with the same economy: specific, documented, consequential. Each one the product of 6 years of daily observation condensed into a sentence and a number. He finished in 4 minutes and 17 seconds. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when the information in them has changed weight. I'm not presenting this as a negotiation, Fletcher said. I'm presenting it because 40,000 people drive vehicles that merit services, and they are entitled to the best available technique regardless of what happens to me or my employment status or the stock value of this company. He closed the notepad. That's all I have. He set the pen down. General Boyd Kessler opened the folder. He did it slowly, with the deliberateness of a man who has decided that every gesture from this point forward is going to be intentional. He removed the top page and placed it flat on the table facing the room. It was the email thread. Oz's correspondence with Ridgeline Auto Group, printed clean, dates and timestamps intact. He placed a second page beside it. A third. I'd like to speak to items not on Mr. Rourke's list, Kessler said. His voice had the particular register of someone who spent 30 years giving orders and has learned to reserve the full weight of that register for moments that require it. These communications were sent from a Merit corporate device to a competitor's acquisition team over a period of 9 months. The subject of those communications is the facilitated sale of this company at a price negotiated in advance of any formal process by a party. He looked at Oz directly for the first time, with a material, personal interest in the transaction. Oz's face did something complicated. The competent authority configuration held for approximately 3 seconds and then began to fail at its edges, the way a maintained thing fails when the maintenance is interrupted. Not all at once, but sequentially, from the points of highest stress. That's a selective interpretation of the access logs are dated. Kessler turned another page. The article source matches 3 specific email threads by content. The Ridgeline acquisition terms include a 7-figure facilitation fee. He set the page down and looked at Oz with the steadiness of a man who has spent 40 years watching people be caught by documents and has stopped being surprised by the specific variety of expression that produces. I've been in rooms like this for 40 years. I know what I'm looking at. The board member to Oz's left shifted in his seat, which was the physical equivalent of a significant statement. The one to his right looked at the ceiling briefly and then back at the table, which was another. Oz began to speak, and Sloane held up one hand, and the gesture was not aggressive, and it was not a performance. And it stopped him with the completeness of something that has genuine authority behind it, rather than the approximation of it. The board will take a 10-minute recess, she said. Mr. Strickland, I'll ask you to wait outside with legal counsel. The counsel I've asked to join us today, not the counsel you brought. She said this with the flatness of someone who has done the sequencing correctly and is now simply executing it. Everyone else, please stay. Oz left. The door closed. Fletcher stayed in his chair and looked at nothing in particular while the 10 minutes happened around him. He heard chairs shift and voices in low consultation and the sound of people revising their positions without wanting to be seen to revise them. He did not participate. He had said what he came to say. What happened next was between the room and itself. At minute 8, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He looked at it under the table. Admiral Hale. He stepped into the corridor. Lieutenant Commander. Hale's voice carried the controlled excitement of a man who has learned to keep elation below the surface and is finding it difficult. Declan Webb Jr. is on a transport out of Landstuhl. He asked me to relay something. A pause. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "Tell Ironside that Chief Webb's granddaughter is going to know his name." Fletcher stood in the corridor outside the boardroom and held the phone against his ear and said nothing for a moment that lasted slightly longer than a moment. "Tell him." His voice caught on something, and he waited for it to clear. "Tell him Chief Webb already made sure of that." He paused. From the other direction. Hale was quiet for 3 seconds. "Yes," he said. "I'll tell him that." Another pause. "The formal ceremony is confirmed for the 14th. Denver, as requested. The Secretary of the Navy will be present." His voice shifted into something slightly less official. "Your father would have understood what you did today, Fletcher. Both the things you did today." He ended the call. Fletcher stood in the corridor for a moment with the phone in his hand and the weight of the day arranged around him in all its components. The article, the nurse's office, Nora's hand holding his on the cot with the crinkly paper cover, the notepad, and the 7 items. Kessler opening the folder, Hale's voice with its controlled weight. He held all of it without trying to resolve it into a single feeling, because it wasn't a single feeling, and imposing that on it would be a kind of dishonesty. Then he went back inside. The vote was 6-2. Oz Strickland was suspended pending formal investigation. The public statement distancing the company from the Navy operation was tabled indefinitely. The External Review Committee resolution was withdrawn. Sloan called it without drama, recorded it without ceremony, and thanked the board for their time. They filed out, most of them avoiding extended eye contact with Fletcher in the specific way of people who are recalibrating their position and have not yet finished the recalibration. Kessler stopped at the door and looked back. He looked at Fletcher for 3 seconds. Then he said, "Your father was a straight shooter. I should have remembered that sooner." He left before Fletcher could respond, which was probably the intention. Darnell Pruitt was in the corridor when Fletcher came out. He had been there, Fletcher understood, for the duration. Not inside, not participating, just present in the way that certain people are present during difficult things, because their presence is itself a form of contribution. "Bay 4's locked up," Darnell said. "Escalade's in the finished bay. Customers picking it up in the morning." Fletcher looked at him. "Thank you for the sandwich yesterday." Darnell's expression did not change significantly, but something in it settled. "Turkey was on sale," he said. He extended his hand. Fletcher shook it, and it was the handshake of 2 people who have been in the same building for 6 years and have just completed the negotiation of what that means. Darnell walked toward the elevator. He did not look back, which was also his preference. The building was quieter now, with the end of the business day asserting itself, the shop floor winding down, the last technicians clocking out, the overhead lights in the corridor switching to their reduced evening setting. Sloan was still in the boardroom when Fletcher looked through the glass panel. She was sitting at the head of the table alone, not looking at anything in particular, in the posture of someone who has done the thing and is now simply sitting with the fact of it. He pushed the door open and she looked up. "The vote was 6-2, she said. Kessler's motion for your reinstatement as Director of Technical Operations is on the agenda for the next formal session. She paused. That's 14 days. I know that's fine, he said. It's not fine. You've been... Sloan. He said her name for the first time, which both of them registered. It's fine. She looked at him. Then she stood and walked to the window that faced north, and he came to stand beside her at the distance of two people who have been through something together and are standing on the other side of it, not touching, not needing to, occupying the same view. The Rockies were fully lit in the last of the afternoon sun, white above the tree line, filling the window with the particular clarity of November light that makes distances seem precise. They stood and looked at it for a moment without speaking. My father used to stand at this window, she said. He said it was the reason he kept the office on the north side when everyone told him the south-facing office had better light for working. She paused. He said some views are worth choosing at the expense of the practical. Fletcher looked at the mountains. Harold said the same thing, in exactly those words. He glanced at her. I think they rehearsed it. She laughed. A real one, unexpected, brief, genuine in the specific way that laughter is genuine when it arrives without being prepared for. It changed the quality of the room. The ceremony is the 14th, he said after a moment. Admiral Hale confirmed it this afternoon. Declan Webb Jr. is being released from Landstuhl by the 10th. He paused. He asked to attend. Sloan looked at him. Chief Webb's son wants to come to the ceremony. His father died so I could fly out. He seems to think there's something in that worth completing. He looked at the mountains. He's not wrong. She was quiet for a moment. Where's the ceremony? He turned and looked at her directly, and there was something in the look that was not complicated, was in fact the simplest version of the thing that had been developing across 2 days and 6 years and a distance that included every mile between San Diego and Denver and every hour between Ironclad and this window. I asked Admiral Hale to hold it here, he said, in the building, on the floor, your father and mine built. He paused. If that's all right. She held his gaze. Harold Rourke's son asking if Harold Rourke's building is all right. I'm asking the person who runs it. She looked at him for a long moment with the steadiness that was no longer armor, was simply her, the actual version underneath the performance she had been sustaining for 2 years. Yes, she said. It's all right. They stood at the window for another minute, looking north at the mountains and the last light, and the building held them the way buildings hold the things that happen inside them, without awareness, without judgment, simply by being present and continuous and large enough to contain what is brought to them. Then Sloane's phone buzzed on the conference table, and Fletcher's phone buzzed in his pocket, and the practical world, which had been waiting with its characteristic impatience, reasserted itself, and they both turned from the window at the same moment, and the moment was over, and something else had begun. He left the building at 5:44 and drove to Clara's house through the Denver evening, the city lit and moving around him with its ordinary purposeful energy. And when Nora came down the front walk in her winter coat with the broken zipper pull, she looked at his face and read it the way she read everything, directly, without flinching, without needing it translated. You did the hard thing, she said. He opened the passenger door for her. We're going to be okay. She climbed in and buckled herself and looked at him over the center console with the 8-year-old's absolute certainty that is either wisdom or its most useful approximation. I know, she said. I knew this morning. He closed her door, walked around to the driver's side. The Rockies were dark now, only their silhouette visible against the last blue of the sky, enormous and patient and present. He got in, started the engine, drove his daughter home through the city his father helped build, and the night came in around them the way nights come, fully, without apology, and full of the ordinary particular light of a place that is, against all reasonable expectation, still yours. Aki 6. The 14th arrived the way significant days always arrive. Without the ceremony the preceding days had suggested it deserved. Just another Tuesday morning, with cold coming off the mountains and the November light that made everything look both final and continuous. Fletcher was up at 5:30. He made coffee, stood at the kitchen window in the dark, and listened to the building settle around him. The radiator, the pipes, the low creak of the floor in Nora's room that meant she had turned over in her sleep. 6 years of mornings in this apartment had given him its complete acoustic inventory. He knew it the way he knew pressure, differential signatures, and tidal current patterns, and the sound of a specific rotor variant at distance. By attention, accumulated over time, until knowing became indistinguishable from simply being present. He had pressed his dress uniform the night before. It had been in the back of the closet in a garment bag since San Diego, moved 3 times without being opened, carried across the distance between who he had been and who he had become without ever being worn again. He had taken it out at 9 o'clock the previous evening and laid it on the bed and stood looking at it for a while, in the specific way you look at an object that has been waiting for something you weren't sure you were going to give it. Then he had gotten the iron from the hall closet and pressed every surface with the care of someone who understands that the care is not about the uniform. Nora appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:15 in her school clothes, saw the garment bag hanging on the back of the bedroom door through the hallway, and looked at Fletcher with the expression of someone encountering a new configuration of a familiar thing. "You look different already," she said, "and you're not even wearing it yet." He handed her a glass of orange juice. "Eat your breakfast." She sat at the table and ate her cereal with one eye on the garment bag and one eye on him, monitoring both with the thoroughness that was her standard operating mode. When she finished, she carried her bowl to the sink, rinsed it, and set it in the drying rack. A sequence she had performed without being asked since she was 5, because Fletcher had shown her once, and she had decided once was enough instruction. She turned and looked at him directly. "Is it okay to be happy today?" The question stopped him in the middle of reaching for his coffee. He looked at her. 8 years old, her mother's eyes, the question sitting in the air between them with the uncomplicated weight of something that needed an actual answer. "Yes," he said. "Your mother would want that specifically." Nora nodded, satisfied, in the way she nodded when she received confirmation of something she had already decided but wanted verified. She picked up her backpack from the chair by the door. "I told Clara's mom that my dad was getting a medal today." She paused with her hand on the strap. She cried a little. "I didn't understand why at first. Why do you think now?" She considered it for a moment with genuine seriousness. "Because some things take a long time to be right, and when they finally are, people feel all the waiting at once." She looked at him. "Is that it?" He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at his daughter and understood, not for the first time, but with the clarity that certain moments produce, that Claire had given him something that could not be diminished by any of the subsequent architecture of loss. "That's exactly it," he said. "She went to school." He put on the uniform. The building was already altered when he arrived at 9. Not the structure. The structure was the same Merritt Automotive building it had always been, the one Harold Rourke and Richard Merritt had built in 1988 from a design Harold had sketched on the back of a materials invoice. But the quality of attention inside it had changed. People moved through the space with an awareness of what it contained today, which changed how they moved through it, the way a room changes when something important is about to happen in it. Darnell Pruitt was in the lobby in a jacket and tie, which Fletcher had never seen before, and suspected had not occurred in at least a decade. He looked at Fletcher in the dress uniform and then looked at the middle distance briefly in the way of someone managing a response they have decided not to voice. Then he straightened slightly and said, "Bay 4 is clean. I put flowers from the deli on the parts counter." He paused. It seemed right. It did seem right. The ceremony assembled in the main floor at 10 o'clock, not in the boardroom, not in the conference room, but on the shop floor itself, among the lifts and the toolboxes and the smell of oil and metal that was the actual material of the place. Admiral Hale had not questioned the location when Fletcher requested it. He had simply said yes and arranged the logistics accordingly. The rows of folding chairs held Merritt employees, retired Navy personnel, 2 journalists who had been given pool credentials, and in the third row, in a wheelchair with his right arm in a sling and his color still not fully restored, Declan Webb, Jr. Fletcher saw him from across the floor when he came in. Webb was 28, his father's jaw and something of his father's bearing even in the wheelchair, the posture of someone trained to occupy space without apologizing for it. He looked up when Fletcher approached, and they regarded each other across the specific distance of men who share a history they did not choose and have had to build a relationship with it regardless. Fletcher extended his hand. Webb took it with his left, his good arm. Neither of them spoke for a moment, which was the right amount of time. "He talked about you," Webb said. "My dad, when I was a kid." His voice was steady in the way of someone who has been rehearsing steadiness and has achieved it. "He said you were the best pilot he ever flew with. Said you saw things other people missed." Fletcher held his gaze. "He gave me 8 years of teaching before Ironclad. Everything I saw that night, I saw because of him." Webb looked at him for a moment longer. Then he nodded, once, with the finality of something completed rather than concluded. Not closed, but arrived at a resting place. "He'd have liked today," he said. "He was big on things being made right." "I know." Fletcher released his hand. "Get some rest. You've earned more of it than I have." Webb produced something that was almost a smile. "Chief Webb's granddaughter is going to know your name," he said. "I already told her. She's 3. She mostly wanted to know if you had a dog." He paused. "Do you?" "No. That disappointed her." He settled back in the wheelchair with the careful economy of someone managing pain without advertising it. "Something to consider." Fletcher moved to the front of the floor where Admiral Hale waited beside General Kessler, who had come in civilian clothes and stood with his hands clasped behind his back and the expression of a man who has settled an account and feels both lighter and more honest for it. Kessler looked at Fletcher as he approached, and the look contained the acknowledgement that Kessler had decided was owed, and that Fletcher received without requiring it to be larger than it was. Sloane was standing to the right of the small platform, not on it, which was correct, because this was not a corporate event and she understood that. In a dark coat with her hands at her sides and her face in the stillness that was hers now, the real version. She looked at Fletcher when he came to stand near her, and she didn't say anything, and he didn't say anything, and the silence between them had the texture of something that had been built over 2 days and 6 years and was holding its weight without effort. Admiral Hale spoke for 7 minutes. He spoke about Ironclad with the precision of someone who had briefed the classified version many times and had learned to carry its full weight in the unclassified one. He spoke about the 17 men. He spoke about Chief Webb, and Fletcher heard his own breathing change at the name and let it change, because there was no version of this day that did not include that grief. And he had stopped trying to manage it out of his public self sometime in the last 2 weeks. He spoke about the 6 years, and the pharmacy parking lot, and the radar signature that had saved a life that Chief Webb's sacrifice had, in a direct line of causation that Hale articulated with the care it deserved, made possible. Then he pinned the medal. The floor was quiet in the specific way that floors full of people are quiet when they have collectively decided that silence is the correct response and have made that decision without coordination. Fletcher stood in the building his father had helped build, in the uniform he had pressed the night before, with the medal on his chest and the weight of everything it represented distributed across 7 years of mornings that had been about nothing more and nothing less than being present for the next one. He looked at the north-facing windows and the November sky beyond them and thought about his father sketching the building's design on the back of a materials invoice, and about Claire writing the letter in the handwriting that Nora was beginning to resemble, and about Nora's voice that morning. Some things take a long time to be right, and when they finally are, people feel all the waiting at once. He looked at Darnell Pruitt in the third row with his jacket and tie and his flowers from the deli, at Perry, the 23-year-old, who was in the back row with his arms crossed and the expression of someone recalibrating what it meant to be good at something, at Declan Webb Jr. in his wheelchair, who caught his eye and tilted his chin upward once, minimally, which meant something, and didn't require translation. At Sloane, standing to the right, who was looking at the north-facing windows the way her father used to look at them, and who turned at the exact moment he looked at her and held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who has decided that steadiness is no longer a performance. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked at the floor, at the concrete that had held the weight of 37 years of work done by people who had cared about doing it correctly, and he understood, with the quiet completion of something that had been in process for a long time, that he was not standing at the end of anything. 9 months later, he stood at the same window on a Tuesday morning with a different quality of light and the Rockies in their spring configuration, less white, more present, the tree line visible again. The director of Technical Operations Office had photographs on the desk in the north-facing window and a door that was open more often than it was closed. Perry was running the Bay 4 training program. The Merit Service Manual had been revised twice. The error rate on hydraulic diagnostics was 4% and falling. Nora was 9 now, healthy, drawing helicopters with more anatomical accuracy than she had managed at 8 and with the same confident interpretation. The drawing on the refrigerator this month showed a pilot in a helmet standing beside an aircraft on a building rooftop, a small figure beside him that was clearly meant to be a child. She had labeled it in the shorthand of someone who already knew the answer. On the desk beside Nora's photograph was a second frame, added 3 months ago without announcement. Harold Rourke and Richard Merritt in a garage in 1988, shaking hands over a workbench, both of them grinning with the specific satisfaction of men who have just decided to build something together and have not yet encountered any of the difficulties. Sloane had found it in the archive and left it on his desk one morning before he arrived, and he had set it in the frame that afternoon, and neither of them had discussed it, because some things don't require discussion to be understood. He heard the shop floor beginning its morning below him, the compressors cycling, the lifts groaning to pressure, the particular acoustic signature of a place that was operating correctly and knew what it was for. He turned from the window, picked up the pen, opened the notebook to a clean page. Outside, through the glass, the sky over Denver held the blue of a morning that has decided to be clear. The mountains held the light the way they always did, without effort or awareness, indifferent to everything arranged at their feet. 9-year-old Nora Rourke, in a classroom 14 blocks north, was in the middle of a drawing that would appear on the refrigerator by evening. A pilot standing on a rooftop beside an aircraft, the mountains behind him. A small figure beside him that was clearly meant to be a child. She labeled it in her careful print, the letters even and deliberate. He came back. She capped the crayon, looked at it for a moment with her mother's angle of attention, and decided it was right.